Welcome to Humanity Under Pressure. I'm your host, Eric Diaz. Humanity Under Pressure explores the realities of living with severe mental illness, which I often refer to as brain disorders, as well as addiction, recovery, advocacy, and family caregiving through conversations with experts, advocates, individuals with lived experience, and family members. We seek to educate, inspire hope, and promote understanding. Today, I am joined by Jerri Clark. Jerri works at the Treatment Advocacy Center, where she supports a national helpline and manages the Schizophrenia and Psychosis Resource Center. She also teaches seminars for families affected by severe mental illness, ambiguous loss. Jerri is the author of Gone Before Gone, a powerful memoir self-help guide that chronicles her son's struggle with severe mental illness, his eventual death, and her journey through grief toward healing. Drawing on the work of Pauline Boss and her own experiences as a mother and longtime yoga teacher, Jerri offers practical tools for families navigating the unique challenges of ambiguous loss. Today, we'll be talking about severe mental illness, grief, ambiguous loss, and what families can do to find hope and support in the midst of incredible, difficult circumstances. Jerri, thank you for joining me today. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate you having me on.
Your book was great, but I wish it was out there 20 years ago. So I guess our first question will be, how does ambiguous loss intersect with grief and mental illness?
Well, first of all, I want to clarify that my experience was related to loving someone with a severe mental illness. So when I say SMI, I mean conditions that are the most disabling and life-altering, conditions that come with psychosis and very often a significant lack of insight, because that's what happened to my son. When he got sick, when he was 19, he was so significantly impacted that it changed everything about our family dynamic from the very, very beginning. When SMI comes into a family, it changes everyone's roles and relationships in such a dramatic way that it's often creating a grief experience at the same time the family is struggling to continue onward in a way that makes any sense. But often the grief isn't acknowledged as grief because it is so confusing. So for example, when my son came home from college, he had been an honors student. He was extraordinary at speech and debate. He had all kinds of things going for him, and he came home completely disoriented, a very, very different version of himself. So it smacked me upside the head that I had lost my son at the same time I was trying to save him. I didn't have time to grieve. And like you said that you wish my book had been available 20 years ago. I wish my book had been available 10 years ago when my son fell ill. I actually wrote the book that I wish someone had written for me. I recognized that I was experiencing grief until hindsight. Right. And so recognizing now I was in deep grief at the same time I was fighting with every tool I could locate to save my son's life. So that is really the crux of the intersection between SMI and ambiguous loss.
I believe you used the term name it to tame it in the book. What did you mean by that? Because ambiguous loss, I knew I was going through something, but I didn't know what was going on. Like you mentioned, your son. My older medication, I myself live with schizoaffective disorder, and my older medication, the cognitive problems were horrible because I wanted to go to, I was out of the hospital, but I couldn't do the things I used to love and enjoy. But you put a name on it, ambiguous loss, or you put a name on no one told me when they gave me my prescription about the cognitive problems I was facing. But describe what you mean by name it to tame it.
So that phrase comes from a neuroscientist named Dan Siegel, and he talks about name it to tame it in terms of emotional regulation. So until we recognize what we're experiencing, it's really difficult to work with it. So until you call grief, it's difficult to figure out, oh, I need tools for grief coping. Until you recognize any emotion, it's really difficult to work with it. I did have one seminar participant. So I teach a seminar on ambiguous loss through my job at TAC. And I had one seminar participant at the end say to me, or say to the group, that she felt like watching other people try on their emotions made her think maybe it would be possible for her to also actually try on her emotions. She'd been pushing aside her emotions for so long as sort of a survival strategy that she was starting to open up to the possibility that she could actually examine the emotional experiences she was having. And I suspect anyone, whether you're a family member who loves someone with a psychotic illness or you're a person experiencing a severe mental illness, part of what is valuable is recognizing what's been lost and what is the meaning behind those losses. With that comes this recognition of the emotions related to loss, right? Including the emotion of grief. I really wish that I had been able to have a conversation with my son Calvin about what he lost when he got sick. Because kind of what you describe, Eric, I know he recognized cognitive decline. And that was devastating to him because he was so sharp. His mind was his thing. Like he was a really quick thinker. He was a state champion in extemporaneous debate. And so being able to grab a hold of facts, pull them out in an opportune moment, and use his intellect to entertain and impress other people had always been part of his personality. And his severe bipolar with psychotic features really took that away from him. And it was a devastating loss. But I suspect he was never really able to articulate that as a loss.
And that I'm so sorry he went through that. I know that is just horrible to go through. And did you know anything about, was it bipolar disorder he had? What did you know about this before your son was diagnosed with this?
I knew very little. And when he came home from college, I described the night that he came home in what was the first psychotic break that I witnessed. I don't know if he had had a psychotic break previously while he was away at college, but he came home in the throes of a psychotic break, and that was the first one I had ever witnessed with him or anyone else. It took me the better part of a day and a night to figure out that's what that was. It was very confusing trying to figure out why his pleas for help didn't quite make any sense. What he was describing and asking for in terms of help didn't add up to anything coherent, but it took a while because he was still very articulate, even when the content of what he was saying was basically a word salad. It was still an articulate word salad. And so it took me quite a while to figure out that something had gone terribly wrong inside his mind. And that's why what he was saying and asking for didn't actually make any sense. So I had a very, very quick learning curve when he got sick. I had very little knowledge of what bipolar disorder was, what psychosis was. I had to learn quickly, and it was a hard path.
First place my family went to when me and my brother had problems was our local NAMI chapter. Did you join NAMI, and can you describe your experience?
I did. I went to our local NAMI affiliate. I went through the family to family program, and it was quite helpful. It was really the first education that I had about these illness conditions. And then I actually became part of a speaker series in our local affiliate called See Me. And it was a program where we talked to various first responders across the system about our experiences when contacting, whether it was paramedics or law enforcement, anyone who might respond to somebody having a mental illness crisis. our team did a training, and it was, I was the family representative, but there were individuals with lived experience on that panel, and there were also professionals as part of that panel. And that was really my first opportunity to share out loud what my family was experiencing. And it was a very helpful opportunity to talk openly about what was really happening.
What I really got out of NAMI, and my mom really got out of NAMI, in addition to other things, was that I felt like everything was unique to my family. Like we were the only ones experiencing this. So that's something that I'm really grateful for. And then one thing you talk about in the book is you write about your son seeing a prescriber, not a doctor. What did you mean by that? And how did fragmented care affect your family's experience?
So different states have different rules in terms of who can prescribe psychiatric medications. And in the state of Washington, where we live and where my son was first treated for his condition, psychiatric nurse practitioners can prescribe without being under the direction of an MD. So psychiatric nurse practitioners were generally who was prescribing medications for him rather than doctors.
Okay. And do you think did you think that that had played a role in your son completing suicide, or yours not recovering?
Well, it's more complicated than that because access to, I mean, I think psychiatric nurse practitioners can be excellent providers of care. Absolutely. So I don't think it was necessarily the level of credential that led my son to fall through the cracks. It was more the level of outreach that was not sufficient to keep track of him when he decompensated extremely quickly. His specific final diagnosis was rapid cycling bipolar disorder with mixed states. So it was a really complicated condition that when he decompensated, he lost his contact with reality really, really fast. So the team was not doing enough outreach to keep track of him when he went from doing pretty well to doing not even remotely okay.
Okay. You said in the book that some people say that discussing openly family trauma and dangerous behavior increases stigma. And how do you respond to that? Because I'll be the first to tell you, when I'm not on my medication, I don't fault anyone for wanting to separate themselves from me, because even if I'm not violent, I say things that I would never say. And I completely understand how my behavior could cause trauma. But explain how you respond to people saying it creates stigma if my mother were to talk about, say, what I'm like without my medication. But how do you respond?
I think stigma is worsened when people are afraid to talk about what's real. And there's a lot of work to create more awareness and acceptance. Okay. And awareness and acceptance are important, but awareness is not treatment. And so accepting someone's difference when that difference is related to an unmet medical need can actually make stigma worse, because it makes the person witnessing this really confusing and sometimes scary behavior unable to do anything to help that person shift toward a more functional behavior, if that makes sense, right? So, yeah.
I understand completely. And not everyone has the privilege of a private breakdown. If I'm out in public acting this way, I would prefer to have an intervention at home with my mom before I'm out in the community. So thank
Yeah.
you for.
Getting people into treatment is the way to fight stigma. Acceptance is also important, but acceptance and awareness cannot replace treatment. And especially when we're talking about behavior that can become dangerous to self or other people, access to treatment is how to respond, right? Not by accepting someone as neurologically different, for example, right? So accepting someone's neurological difference when they are desperately in need of treatment to prevent harm just makes everybody confused. And when the public is confused, stigma is worse.
My psychosis was a disease that needed to be treated, not a right to be protected. I'm very grateful that I'm on my medication. And you were told your son would be better off getting arrested. And did getting arrested get any help, and who told you that?
Crisis lines, providers. At one point when my son was actually my son's final arrest happened in the Seattle area, and he had a case manager, and I called her just absolutely beside myself with grief that my son had been incarcerated, and she said, settle down. This is good news. Now he can get the level of treatment that he needs. It was so untrue.
Do you know of any other disease where the providers say that?
Right?
Yeah, because people with Alzheimer's, I don't hear
let's get him arrested. Yeah, let's get him arrested and then see what happens. Once they've funneled down through that very bottom of the system, is there something? Now, I will say that final arrest that happened in the Seattle area did lead to an assertive community treatment team and housing. So it did in some ways finally elicit some of the services that he needed all along. But the fact that the state had withheld those services until incarceration just shows how far downstream our resources have been pushed.
So a community treatment team and housing is only available if you get arrested or at that time.
That was our experience.
Okay. And you used the phrase discrimination disguised as social justice. What do you mean by that?
Specifically referring to the IMD exclusion. So IMD refers to institutions of mental disease, and IMD exclusions are part of the Social Security Acts that were passed in the 1960s. So when Medicaid was established as part of the Social Security Acts, reimbursement for somebody with public insurance through Medicaid, reimbursement for inpatient stays was limited in days and or size of facility. So a facility with more than 16 inpatient psychiatric beds is not reimbursable by Medicaid under the IMD exclusion. So they pushed this through in part saying, well, we're getting rid of the old asylums of the past. Those were terrible institutions. We don't want people institutionalized. So we don't really know where the number 16 came from, but we're going to prevent large institutions or asylums from ever being possible again by making sure that Medicaid won't reimburse a stay in a facility with more than 16 beds. So the social justice angle was, in my opinion, a disguise for a way to save a lot of money.
Yeah, I feel that way too. But first off, do you know of a rule like that in Medicaid for any other disease or disability?
There is no rule like that for any other disease category. So that's the discrimination piece. And that's why I said, yeah.
Yeah, I feel that way too, because sometimes when you argue about recovery looks different for everyone. Where I'm at now was not where I was at on the medication that was available to me like in 2001. And some people, recovery for them will mean a structured housing, like supportive housing. Very few will need to be in a hospital long term. But recovery for schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder looks different for everyone. And sometimes when I talk to people, I eventually comes down to they want that money for other stuff. And that's not, you're not advocating for that person. And that frustrates me. And many anti-stigma campaigns focus on normalization and similarity. Do you think some messaging unintentionally minimizes the severity of what families like ours experience?
Absolutely. There was nothing normal about what happened to my son when his brain got sick. There was nothing normal about that. And a society that believes they need to normalize that just runs, and it leads to isolation for families like ours. If everyone thinks that they're just supposed to accept that what's happening is normal, then they will just turn tail and run. So calling it out, this is not normal, and these illness conditions are treatable. The answer to the problem in front of us is treatment access. And if the public could focus on improving treatment access, I think we would see less stigma. People would be less afraid of illness conditions that are treatable if they're confident that our society is providing treatment.
I completely agree. Yes, I just nothing more to add to that. I just completely agree. You said, and you write thoughtfully about boundaries and guilt. How do boundaries differ from giving up on someone you love?
Well, I'll just go to one of the hardest examples from my own story. And that was when I needed to take out an order of protection because my son's untreated symptoms were creating a risk for harm in our household. And I had always imagined that I would be that mom who always kept a spare key hidden so any of my family members could come home at any time if they needed to, that I would always welcome anyone in my close circle home. But it became unsafe. And it wasn't just unsafe for me, it was unsafe for him. Because if he acted out because of a psychotic delusion, he might hurt me, and hurting me was absolutely also going to hurt him. So the boundary needed to be, we are still doing everything in our power to support you, to help you access the care and treatment that you need. But coming home is not an option right now. And that was a boundary that we needed to set in a very firm way.
And one thing that makes me angry is no family should ever be in that situation. The government should intervene at the health department. And has advocacy helped you process your grief and regain some ability to experience joy and meaning?
Yes. And one of the coping guidelines that I teach in my ambiguous loss work is reconstruct identity. So I described how I was that mom who always kept a spare key hidden, always left the lights on, always had the fridge stocked and the beds made. That was part of my sense of self. I was that kind of mom, right? I had to reconstruct my sense of self when that was no longer going to work. So my identity kept shifting and changing as I was a caregiver for this very unwell young son. He was an adult, but he was still very young. He died when he was 23. So I was constantly re-envisioning what my role was as his mom. And then when he died, that newly revised role also came apart. And I had to reconstruct my identity again. And advocacy gave me a new identity, a new place that I could contribute, a place where I belong, a place where what has happened in my family matters and can impact people's thinking and hopefully help promote system reform.
All right. I also thank you very much for this book. Your book helped me a lot. And I'll get to that in a second, but in the book, you mentioned hope with agency. What does that phrase mean to you, especially for families living through a chronic crisis?
When things were really rough, I was told in some spaces like support group types of spaces to hold on to hope. And to me, that felt very passive, and it felt like wishful thinking was getting in my way. Sitting around and wishing for things to be different than they were was just making me feel worse and worse about the difference between what I wanted and what I was getting and what was happening, right? So I let go of the word hope, and I found a lot of relief in that. I was reading some work by Pema Chodron at the time. She's a Buddhist nun. For example, she wrote a book called When Things Fall Apart, and she talks about groundlessness and giving up on hope as a way to fall into the reality that you're experiencing in order to get your feet on a new sense of ground and then grow from there. So to me, letting go of wishful thinking, letting go of and letting myself fall into the groundlessness of not knowing gave me something to push against as I decided what actions were available to me. And that's what I called agency. So instead of putting resource into wishful thinking, I was going to put resource into agency. What might I try? What might I do? And when I got deep into the work of Dr. Pauline Boss and her ambiguous loss theory, one of her coping guidelines is to discover new hope. And she talks about new hope as an action whereas old hope is passive. And I realized that by new hope, she was talking in a way that matched what I meant when I said agency. What can I still try despite not getting what I originally wanted? What is still possible if we envision something new and work toward it? So new hope has agency. New hope is an activity. Old hope to me is passive and wishful thinking, which can just kind of take you into a downward spiral when things are not working out.
All right. And when people finish your book or watch this interview, what do you hope they understand differently about severe mental illness, ambiguous loss, and the families living through it?
Mental illness, as you well know, Eric, and thank you so much for reading my book. And I love knowing that somebody who is experiencing severe mental illness is also benefiting from these guidelines related to ambiguous loss. That means a lot to me. So I really appreciate you reading the book, digesting it, and explaining how it's benefited you. That means a lot to me. Mental illness is not a lifestyle choice. It is an illness condition that needs treatment. People who experience this no fault, brain based set of conditions deserve help. And their families also deserve help, including help to manage a grief beyond belief. Ambiguous loss is not a pathology. There's nothing wrong with a person who is struggling to manage the sense of grief that comes from ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss is circumstantial. It's caused by something that's happening in your life that is beyond human expectation. So just like we would never expect our family to experience terrorism, we would not expect our family to experience something going wrong in a loved one's brain that makes them an entirely different version of themselves. That is a beyond human expectation kind of experience. And so the loss experience is also beyond expectation, which creates a very complex experience of grief. And our families have been for so many decades blamed and shamed and pushed away and put in HIPAA handcuffs instead of being seen for this intensely sad experience that we're living.
And one thing I just thought of that you mentioned in the book, you described you said you will not be shushed or bullied into being silent. And describe that because I know a lot of people just describe what you meant by that.
So I actually was telling a story about going to a listening session with a disability rights group that was doing some really important work in terms of decriminalizing illness and getting people who had fallen into the carceral system restored to competency. That's probably enough detail on the circumstances. But I was trying to explain in the context of this listening session that the reason my son had been incarcerated was because the system waited and watched while he got sicker and sicker and sicker before doing anything to help him stop the cycle of psychosis that was taking him out. And this particular disability rights group didn't want me to talk about that because they didn't believe in any kind of involuntary treatment as part of the solution. They only wanted to talk about what had happened after he was incarcerated. And it was really frustrating to me to be shushed when I could so clearly see the catch-22 in the system. This catch-22 that said, well, we don't want to criminalize people, but we're not going to do anything until they're criminalized.
Well, thank you for not being shushed. And I'm glad I could help share the story. I too have felt that way at times. And one thing that I do support assisted outpatient treatment, which I'll do an episode on that later. I maybe have a link below in the when I share this. But one thing that benefited me was when I was in a clinical trial at Emory University, I didn't think I needed medication, but they paid me to participate. So that is something I feel like, yes, we do need, if I'm on the street, please, you're not taking away my right. You're taking away the right of my illness, psychosis. But I wish when it comes to people that are too sick to, like I was, if more emphasis was placed on that, because when we don't acknowledge it, we can't come up with a way to address it. So thank you for putting a name on it. And thank you very much for all that you do. And thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, Eric. And I want to share with you that my son said to me, and he also said it on an NPR radio station when he was interviewed. He said, they didn't protect my civil rights. They made sure I would lose all my rights by going to jail. And I wish that my son had had the opportunity to participate in AOT because I think it could have been the difference.
I'm very sorry for your loss. Thank you for like I say, thank you for everything you do. All right. And
Thank,
go ahead.
Thanks for having me on, Eric. I really appreciated talking with